Good afternoon. It's pre-lunch, and I'll try to keep you all engaged, and I'll try to make it fast. And also, in case you've wondered why I put a flag here, is simply to let you know that I'm from another country, because I look a lot like y'all. And I keep telling y'all that I am from another country, and I love this place because everybody keeps talking to me in so many languages. And meanwhile, again, another clue, just to identify a Sri Lankan from an Indian, is we have very long names. So, starting off with my name, I'm Sumanthri Samaravikrama, and I have three co-authors, Lakmali Pereira, Malindi Jayatunga, and Sajini Pathiranage. And we are all from the Integrated Design Department, and our title is known as Visual Variety of Typographic Compositions in Sinhala Display Typefaces. So just to make it simple and less complicated, of omitting all the research design terminology, this research is about newspapers. And more specifically regarding newspaper titles. And why do I do it? Because there is so much of variety. And that was the whole idea behind my research. And again, I need to go back into where I'm coming from. So I'm a lecturer and a researcher, and I love type. I completed my PhD on the anatomy of, finding out the anatomy of the Sinhala letter and its distinct features. And of course, with this, I realized when I was doing it, we did not have enough specimens to do a whole understanding of a typeface. So therefore, with that PhD, I also started understanding the evolution of the printed letter of the Sinhala script. And that was only on body, and it was, I wouldn't say boring, it was more like it's the same letter in very minute changes. And while I was looking at the body, I was actually flirting with the other, which was the display typefaces on the newspapers. So, but this research, therefore, I dedicated completely to display typefaces and how it had been. So, defining what a display typeface is, anything beyond 15 points used as a display. It need to be readable and need not be legible. So to start off this, I paid a visit, which I constantly do, to the Department of Archives, National Archives, Colombo, and I just started looking at newspapers, and with these newspapers was something quite interesting. I recorded the development of the Sinhala newspaper. So, my research started off with recording from 1860, which is the first newspaper, Sinhala newspaper, to 1980. This is also the pre-digital era, just before the digital. And every year, I've recorded the number of newspapers that had come in, and you can see the growth. And of course, there are spurts, growth spurts at different points. This is also due to political and social reasons. And it's quite interesting because this also talks about how expression and the typography within the titles are explained. So the data collection was on random sampling. So I took 3 newspapers per decade. And, but whereas the early newspapers, we did not have that many newspapers printed, so therefore, early 50 years, we recorded a few more, and then this was chronologically observed. Starting off with the research, we looked at the components of the compositional block, which I called is beyond, above the date line. And of course, there were very significant key features. We had either illustrations or we had a type-driven typeface. And in that, these components, like the title, the Sinhala title, and we'll always have English translation, illustration or illustrations with it, and notices on either sides, of the newspaper. It would also denote if it's registered, the volume number, edition number, date of the newspaper published, and the price. So these are like all the components, but I'm right now only focusing on the letter, and I went beyond only on the letter and started analyzing it further. So there were certain things that this is how the analysis started off. So the titles were very clearly, they had different baselines. So on the left-hand side, that's my left-hand side, these are the versions of how the different baselines were composed on the titles. And to start observing it, the titles were digitized, and in the sense we drew on top of it, and we analyzed the baseline. And with that, we would know the different types of ways of composing the letters. Then, of course, we went into the second stage, which was identifying the center of the letter, because this was important for us to figure out how the letter works, because we wouldn't know the skeleton. And if we know the skeleton, then we know the amount of weight or flesh that is being added into the letter. So therefore, the next stage was simply identifying the center line. This was an easy one because this had already, the title already had a center line. And with drawing the center line comes in the variations of how the baseline shifts. So this is also noted because this was done as within 4 steps, so that we'll be able to recreate these letters as well later on. So this is a few examples, and on the example D talks about how when we have visuals or letters that has different elements such as outlines or shadows, how do we analyze the center line? So we just fill the whole overall composition, and then we identify the center point. And with that, we place it again on the baseline as the start. And after you place it on a baseline, you have to right now know your anatomy. So in Sinhala, there are 5 reference lines that are identified when you're drawing the letter. And these letters, this is placed on the letter, and therefore we were able to identify that the designer, the craftsman of at that time, how they had drawn the letter, and certain features had moved. So as a result, we would see several center lines, we would say several in-between lines, we would see several eye lines, and so on. So this is quite interesting to know, or the data is enough for us to know if to recreate it and how to, if we want to make it formalized, we could stick to it, or simply stick with the idea of having several lines because it makes it what it is. Then we observe the letters. Example, this is a single letter that we have taken in, which is the width, the height versus width. So as a result, as a analyzing point, the eye is a key feature in the Sinhala letter. And what we do here is we take this as the main ratio point and identify the body height. So as a result, we are able to figure out the height of the letter in comparison with the eye. And as a result, we know the height of the letter, and the same is being analyzed across. So we know the width of the letter. So in general, we would see a whole range of how letters keep changing because of the proportions of the letter. And then, of course, playing of the reference lines, you hold on to the same width, the baseline, and we can also do the change by changing the ascender lines and the descender lines, and as a result, we would get different forms of letters. And the next stage was how the letters itself have its own shape. So it's not only always circular, even though it will fall into a circular letter, but it has been given different formations. Now we went the other way around. How do we start looking at the flesh of the display type? So we have the skeleton, and now we start adding in. And when we start adding in, we know how the stress levels are being used. We know how the contrasts are being played, how the thin and the thicks are played. Then we went in analyzing the styles. So this is mainly focused on the terminals. So because the terminals are the ones that actually helps us identify the features, the flesh or the style of that particular letter, because it only starts with the skeleton, but then the next stage is that. And this is another example. And then the fourth point was the embellishments. Very clearly how these things, how the flesh is being added into a display type itself. And this goes in, I've listed it based on the analysis. So we have outlines simply to give a three-dimensional look. We have elevations, so we give a complete three-dimensional projection out from it. And then of course the bevel effect, which is quite interesting to identify, also know that that had been existing. And also we have the drop shadow, we have outline with the drop shadow, and of course the foreground. Other things that brings in the embellishments would be the add-ons, which is you have textures on the letter, you have illustrations placed on the letter or placed in the letter. So as a result, we have all those, including the floral element, add-ons, the decorative elements, and the decorative theme-based elements. So this is all based on the letters, the newspapers that we have identified. So across, if we look at it and put it in a chronological order, we'll also be able to understand the different effects that had ruled at different stages. So in general, this is how it may look like. And this is what we had, and this is what we understood from the research. So why do we do such research? So one is I'm an academic, I have to do this, and I love doing it. And okay, of course, this research helps to encourage the design process, the type design process. It contributes to the knowledge that we already know. And obviously, with the talks that we had in the mornings, I would say this way of analyzing the anatomy and all that, the distinct features of a letter could help you rework on the structure. And of course, Chirag's, I was quite impressed. I don't know if he's here. Yes, hi. So there, but I think you could take this forward is simply by understanding these structures. And since we know the distinct features, we can actually rotate those features and we can simply, I can see potential. Okay. And so then, of course, point 2 is towards creating new type designs. Obviously, all of us get stuck, and all of us do want to start our own font. This is a start. So this research was based on that. And third point is we document it, and so that we have enough specimens for further studies. Number 4 is to identify design patterns in a chronological order. So within the whole, the cultural context, we could also talk across cultures, across countries, across regions on how certain patterns had, or styles had evolved within the script, and of course to share knowledge across other scripts. And I have to say, this was yesterday. Okay, so very clearly after, at the workshop, okay, so where I had some amazing few students, participants, and I was stunned and I was so happy to see this. So they were initially given the Sinhala newspaper title, and we looked at the process on how the skeleton, the flesh, and the add-ons and so embellishments were brought in. And we have designs from Akila, which converts into Sinhala into Telugu, and Sinhala into, again, Telugu with the E, and they created their own name. I'm sure, now I wouldn't know the bottom line, but I know the top. But still we see visual similarities and how this type of knowledge can be shared and practically work. And we also worked on a whole process on how we can identify the letter forms, the same process. It was displayed. We were waiting for you all to come and see. And this was another example. So with this, I would like to conclude. And this is, again, from Sinhala to Latin, done by Sanjeet Kumar. And I would definitely want to give I want to applaud the team, the students who actually came in and made sure that this was actually possible. So thank you to all the participants as well.